The third night of the great snow, the bell above the Duke's apartments rang once, and then stopped, and Hesper was already on the stairs before she had decided to climb them. She carried no candle. The corridors of Wintermere Abbey had taught her their darkness in 4 months of service, and she knew the 17 steps to the gallery by the cold seam of air that crossed the 8th one. When she reached the door, he had forbidden every servant to open without his summons. She opened it. He was on the floor, between the bed and the hearth. The fire had burned to a red eye. His arms had drawn in against his chest, and his heels struck the boards in a rhythm that was not a man's choosing, and the sound from his throat was the sound of a creature with no language left to it. She had seen this before in another house, over a body she had loved. She did not scream. She knelt, put the rolled hem of her apron between his teeth so he would not bite through his tongue, turned his head so the spittle ran clear, and held his shoulder, not to still him, which could not be done, but so that whatever part of him remained inside that storm would feel a hand and know it was not alone. It lasted the length of a slow 100 counts. Then his heels went quiet, and his breath came back ragged and enormous, and his eyes opened and found her face above him in the dying firelight. For a long moment, the Duke of Renmore looked at the maid who had seen him reduced to nothing, and the maid looked back, and neither of them said a single word. What she did not yet know was that this silence, and not the snow, and not the season, would decide the rest of her life. His name was Tristan, though no one at Wintermere said it, and to the village of Strood below the abbey he was only his grace the master. No one met the landlord whose rents were collected by his steward, and whose face had not been seen at church in 2 winters. To the household he was a closed door and a ringing bell. The maid said he had been wounded in the war, and could not bear the sight of company. The groom said he had buried a wife, and gone strange with it. Both were wrong, but a household will furnish its own explanations when the truth is locked above the 17th stair. Hesper had come to Wintermere in the autumn with 1 box, 1 good gown, and a character reference written in a hand she had partly written herself. Her father had been an apothecary in a market town, 3 counties south, a thin, patient man named Ambrose Lyle, who had taught her to read a Latin label before she could plait her own hair, to weigh a grain of calomel without the brass weight, to know the smell of a fever turning. He had taught her, too, the thing that ladies were not taught, the falling sickness, and its management, because her younger brother had carried it from the age of 9, and for 11 years Hesper had been the one who knelt and turned the head and counted the slow 100. Her brother had died, not of the sickness, but of a winter that took half the town, and her father had followed him in the spring, and the shop and its stock had gone to a cousin who had no use for a daughter. So the apothecary's girl had become a maid, because a girl who could read and reckon and hold her tongue could always be a maid, and a maid had a roof. To the household of Wintermere, she was the quiet new one. To Mrs. Renton, the housekeeper, she was a steady pair of hands who did not gossip and did not flinch at the long, dark corridors. To the other maids, she was a little above herself, with her careful speech and her clean nails, and the book she kept under her mattress, which they had found and mocked and could not read. The room had decided in the easy way. Rooms decide that she thought herself too fine for the work. None of them knew what she had buried, or what she could do, or that she had taken a post in a house no one wanted, because a house no one wanted asked no questions of a girl with sorrow on her. That had been her whole intention, to be invisible, to earn her bread in a place where no one looked too closely, and to be looked at by no one at all. The snow had ended, that the snow had put her on the 17th stair. In the morning he sent for her, not by name, for he did not know it. He told Mrs. Renton to send up the maid who had been in his rooms in the night, and Mrs. Renton, who knew nothing of the night, looked at Hesper with a new and careful fear, as though the girl had done something that could not be undone. Hesper climbed the 17 steps a second time, in daylight, which was somehow worse. He was dressed and seated by the window with the white country burning beyond the glass. By daylight, The Duke of Renmore was younger than the household legend, no more than 34, with a jaw like the edge of a struck flint and eyes the gray of slate under rain. He did not look like a man who had been on his own floor the night before. He looked like a man who had spent his life arranging not to be seen there. "You know what you saw," he said. His voice was low and level, a voice that gave commands and did not raise itself to do it. "Yes, your grace, say it." She understood that he was testing whether she would lie, and that a lie would be the end of her. "You have the falling sickness," she said. "Since boyhood, I should think, by the way you carry yourself for it. Last night was a strong one. They are worse in the cold." Something moved behind his eyes, very far back, like a stone shifting at the bottom of a well. He had spent 20 years being told by physicians that the word was not to be spoken, that the condition had no name in good company, that a man so afflicted was a man unfit. He had paid a great deal of money for that silence. And here was a chambermaid naming it to his face in the plain tone of a woman naming the weather. "And you mean to tell the others," he said. "I mean to tell no one anything," Hesper answered. "I have buried 2 people I loved with that same sickness on them. I came here to be left alone, your grace, as I think you did. We are, in that, the same kind of person. I will hold your tongue from your teeth when you need it, and I will say nothing in the morning. That is all I want, to be let be." It was the longest speech she had made in 4 months, and it cost her, and she saw it land. He looked at her for a long time. Then he said a thing she did not expect. "There is a man," he said, "who would give his right hand to learn what you learned last night. Stay with me here, because this is the hinge on which the whole of it turned. And it turned not on love, which neither of them was thinking of, but on law." The man was Lionel Quayle, the Duke's first cousin on his mother's side, and the heir presumptive to the dukedom of Renmore, so long as Tristan died without a son. Lionel Quayle had debts that no estate of his own could carry, and a confident, handsome, hungry certainty that the title was as good as his, delayed only by his cousin's stubborn refusal to die. He had visited Wintermere twice, in the autumn, all warmth and concern, and both times Hesper had passed him in the corridor and felt the chill of a man counting the silver with his eyes. What Lionel wanted was not the Duke dead. Death was uncertain and slow. What Lionel wanted was proof, for there was in the law of that age a door through which a confident heir might seize what was not yet his, and that door was the commission of lunacy. A man shown to be of unsound mind, incapable of governing his affairs, could be placed under the management of his nearest relation, his estate administered, his person confined, his name kept living, only as a signature, another hand controlled. The falling sickness in the cruel medicine of the day was named by some physicians as a disorder of the brain, a kindred of madness. One sworn account from a credible witness who had seen the Duke insensible on his own floor, his body in revolt, his reason gone for the length of a slow 100 counts, and Lionel Quayle would have his door. The maid who had knelt in his locked apartments was that witness. She was the most dangerous person in England to the Duke of Renmore, and she had not known it until he told her. And now they both knew it, and the snow went on falling. "So you see my difficulty," he said. "I have spent 20 years and a fortune to keep this from leaving these walls, and now it stands in front of me, in an apron, asking only to be let be. A wish I would grant gladly, if I could believe a wish would hold against the price my cousin would pay to break it. I am not for sale to your cousin, your grace. Everyone is for sale to my cousin, he has only to find the figure." He turned the slate eyes on her. "I do not insult you. I tell you the world as it is. A maid's silence is a thing a duke cannot own. It can be bought from her, frightened from her, or talked from her over a glass by a clever man who finds her dull post and offers her a better one. The only silence the law respects, in a wife. A wife cannot be made to testify against her husband. A wife who shares his name shares his ruin, and so has no profit in his fall. A wife is the one mouth in England my cousin cannot open." Hesper understood him before he finished, and the understanding emptied the air from the room. "You are proposing," she said carefully, "to marry me, to keep me quiet." "I am proposing," said the Duke of Renmore, "a bargain. I do not ask for your affection, and I will not pretend to mine. You would have my name, this house, security for the whole of your life, and the freedom of these halls. I would have the one thing money cannot purchase, which is a silence the law will hold. You came here to vanish from the world. I am offering to leave you alone in a great deal more comfort, and to be let be myself, which is all I have wanted these 20 years. It is a cold thing I am offering you. I know it. I have nothing warm left to offer." She should have said no. A wiser woman, a colder one, would have weighed the strangeness of it and refused. Instead, Hesper Lyles stood in a freezing corridor of a house she had chosen for its loneliness, and she heard in the Duke's level voice the exact note of her own grief. The note of a person who had decided long ago that being left alone was the most the world would give them, and she found she could not despise him for offering her the very wall she had built around herself, only made of stone and acreage instead of silence and a borrowed name. "It is not a marriage," she said. "No, it is a lock with 2 keys." He almost smiled. "Yes, that is exactly what it is." "Then I will turn mine," said Hesper, "and ask you to turn yours, and we will both be left alone behind the same door." They were married 11 days later, in the cold little church at Strood with Mrs. Renton and the steward, Mr. Dinn. Asgar as the only witnesses, and the curate so frightened of the great absent Duke, suddenly present in his pews that he lost his place twice in the service. Hesper wore her one good gown, a soft green that had been her mother's, taken in at the waist. The Duke wore black. There was no wedding breakfast and no bell rung and no word sent to London, where the news, when it came, would land in the rooms of Lionel Quayle like a dropped coal. To the household, the marriage was a scandal and a wonder, and a thing to be whispered over the copper pans. The Duke had married a chambermaid. The maids who had decided Hesper thought herself too fine now had their proof and their grievance both. Mrs. Renton, who alone half understood, said nothing and watched, and Hesper moved her one box up the 17 stairs to a cold suite of rooms beside the Duke's own, and lay awake the first night, listening through the wall for the rhythm of his heels against the boards, ready to rise, and heard only the wind, and slept at last as the gray came up over the snow. For 3 weeks they were strangers under one roof, courteous and apart. He breakfasted alone and rode out alone in the brief hard light, and returned and shut his door. She walked the long gallery and read in the library, which he had told her, in the flat tone of a man granting a stranger the run of his house, was hers to use. She found there what she had not expected, which was that the cold Duke read everything, that the margins of his books were thick, with a furious, cramped hand arguing with the dead, and that on the shelf nearest the fire stood a row of medical volumes, every one of them turned to the chapters on his own affliction, every one of them annotated in that same hand with a single repeated word in the margins, not a curse, but a question. Why? 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 She came to understand the shape of him, the way she had come to understand the dark corridors, by the cold seams where the pain crossed. He had been a second son, not raised to the title, given the army instead, and a commission, and a life of his own choosing. The sickness had been a boyhood thing, mild, hidden, manageable, until his elder brother died unwed and unwarned of a fever, and the dukedom fell on Tristan like a roof falling, and with it came the physicians and the warnings and the discovery that the small private affliction of a soldier was in a duke. A duke must marry. A duke must get an heir. And a duke with the falling sickness must do these things, knowing that a wife would learn his secret in the first hard winter, and a child might carry the curse in its blood, and an entire dynasty might be undone by a thing that lived in the dark, behind his own eyes. So he had not married. He had shut the door and let the legend grow, and waited, year on year, for his cousin to find the crack in the wall. She learned all this not from him, but from the books and the margins and the one portrait in the gallery, that the household had turned to the wall, which she turned back, and which showed a laughing young officer in a red coat with the Duke's exact grey eyes and none of the Duke's stone, a man who had not yet had a roof fall on him. She stood before it a long time. Then she heard a step and turned, and he was in the doorway, looking at the portrait of himself and at her having found it. "Turn it back to the wall," he said. He did not say it as a command. He said it as a man asks for mercy, and she did not turn it back. And after a moment he came and stood beside her, the width of a careful yard between them, and they looked together at the man he had been. "I was 26, he said. "I thought it was the worst thing that could happen to me. The army. Marching about in the rain, I would give the rest of my years to be that wet and stupid and free." It was the first thing he had ever told her that was not a fact or a command. She did not answer it with sympathy, which she sensed he would refuse the way a starving man refuses charity, but with the truth, which was the only currency that passed between them. "My brother used to say, the worst part was not the falling," she said. "It was the waiting to fall. The not knowing the day. He said it was like living downstream of a dam, knowing the water would come, never knowing the hour." She watched the slate eyes and saw the stone shift. "He was the bravest person I ever knew. He carried it 20 years, and it never once made him cruel." The Duke looked at her for a moment that went on too long. "You are telling me I am cruel." "I am telling you that you need not be," said Hesper, and turned and left him with the laughing officer, because she had learned that the only way to give that man anything was to give it and walk away before he could refuse it. And that night, for the first time, when the bell did not ring, she found herself listening for him not out of duty, but out of something she had no name for, and did not want to name, and she lay awake a long while on the wrong side of the wall. The letter from Lionel Quayle came with the first thaw. It was all warmth. He had heard the joyful news of his dear cousin's marriage. He wrote, and longed to offer his felicitations in person, and would do himself the honor of calling at Wintermere within the fortnight, that he might be presented to the new Duchess, and embrace the happy change in his cousin's fortunes. The Duke read it once at the breakfast table, his face perfectly still, and passed it across to Hesper without a word. "He does not believe it," she said, reading. "He believes it entirely. That is what frightens him. A childless duke is a duke who may yet die without issue and leave him everything. A married duke is a duke who may get a son and leave him nothing." Tristan refolded the letter along its crease. "He is not coming to embrace anything. He is coming to learn whether the marriage is real and whether you are a wife or a witness with a wedding ring and whether there is yet a crack he can open before a child closes it forever." "Then we must be real," said Hesper. It was the most dangerous thing either of them had yet said, and they both knew it. And neither of them looked at the other when she said it. Lionel Quayle arrived on a fine raw morning in a carriage too good for his debts, with a manservant and a quantity of luggage that promised a long stay, and a second gentleman he introduced as Mr. Sefton, a man of business, come to assist with certain tedious matters of the estate that touched them all. Mr. Sefton was grey and quiet and watchful, with the still eyes of a man whose whole profession was looking, and Hesper knew him at once for what he was, not a man of business, a gatherer, a finder of witnesses. Lionel had not come alone to look. He had brought a man to build a case. The cousin was everything the Duke was not, all open warmth and easy laughter, and he took Hesper's hand at the foot of the great stair and held it a moment too long, and said with eyes that counted the worth of her green gown and found it wanting, "My dear cousin, what a charming surprise you are." We had all quite given Tristan up. The country must agree with him at last. And Hesper, who had spent 4 months learning to be invisible and 20 years learning to read a face, smiled the smile of a duchess and said, "The country agrees with us both, sir. I find I was made for quiet places." And she fell to Mr. Singh. Sefton, behind his master's shoulder, mark her, and weigh her, and begin. The days that followed were a siege conducted at the dinner table and in the drawing room, a war of warmth. Lionel was charming to her without rest. He sought her out alone in the gallery, and spoke with a brother's familiarity of how trying his cousin's moods must be. How cold a house this was for a young wife. How a woman of her evident quality deserved gaiety and society. How very much he should like to be her friend in a family that must seem so strange to her. He laid before her, without ever naming it, the whole of the bribe a better post, in the old language of her old life. Bah! Comfort, friendship, a place in the world, in exchange for the only thing she had that he wanted, which was the truth of what happened behind the locked door, on the cold nights. She gave him nothing. She gave him a duchess who loved her quiet husband and her quiet house, and pitied, gently, the cousin who could not understand either. And every evening she carried back to Tristan, in his study with the door shut, the day's small advances of the enemy, and they sat on opposite sides of the fire, and took the war apart between them, like two strategists. And it was in those nights, plotting the defense of a secret neither of them could afford to lose, that the wall between them began, without either of them permitting it to come down. "Sefton has been to Strood," Tristan said one night. "Oscar saw him at the inn. He has been buying ale for the grooms who were here in the autumn, for Mrs. Ma, Renton's predecessor, who was turned off for drink, and bears me a grudge. Then he is gathering accounts of the household legend," said Hesper. "The master who was never seen. The wounded man who cannot bear company. He will dress it up in a physician's words, and call it derangement." She turned the problem in the firelight. "It is all rumor. Rumor will not satisfy a commission. They will want a witness who saw it. They will want me. They will never have you. They do not know that. They think a maid married for her silence is a silence that can be unbought." She looked at him. "Lionel will make me an offer before he leaves a clear one. And when I refuse it, he will know the marriage is real and that the legal road is shut to him through me. And then, Tristan, he will try the other road." It was the first time she had used his name. It fell into the warm air between them, and neither of them remarked on it, but he heard it. She saw him hear it, and something in the stone of his face cracked along a new seam. "What? Other road?" he said quietly. "He will try to make it true," said Hesper. "If he cannot prove you unfit, he will try to produce the proof. A man like Sefton does not only find witnesses, he makes them a sworn account from a physician your cousin has paid. A letter in your hand that reads like a madman's. He will manufacture the dam and break it himself." The Duke was silent a long time. The fire ate down. When he spoke, his voice had a roughness in it she had not heard before. The roughness of a man setting down a weight he had carried alone for 20 years and finding another pair of hands beneath it. "For 20 years, he said, "I have fought this in the dark, by myself, certain that the day it came into the light I would be finished, because no one who saw the truth could fail to use it against me. And here you are. You saw the truth on the first night. You have had it in your hand for 2 months. You could have sold it to my cousin for everything you have ever wanted, and instead, you sit by my fire and help me defend it." He looked at her as though seeing her for the first time, not the witness, not the wife of the bargain, but the woman. Why, it was the word from all the margins. Why? And she gave him the only answer she had. "Because I know what it is," said Hesper, "to be the thing that happens behind the door, and to be loved by exactly one person, who knelt and held your shoulder so you would not be alone in it. I held my brother that way for 11 years. There is no profit in it. There never was. There is only that you do not let the person fall alone." Her voice was not quite steady. "I did not marry your name, Tristan. I married the person on the floor. I knew him before I knew the Duke." The fire snapped. The yard of careful air between them was suddenly nothing at all, and neither of them crossed it, but they both knew in that moment, that it had stopped being a wall and become a threshold, and that one of them, someday, would step across it. It was Lionel Quayle who forced the day. He made his offer on a Thursday in the gallery with the turned portrait at her back. He dropped the warmth at last and spoke as one practical person to another. He knew, he said, what kind of marriage this was. A duke did not wed a chambermaid for love. He wed her for silence. And silence, my dear, is a perishable thing. Tristan was not a well man. Tristan would not make old bones. And when he was gone, or set aside, where would she be? A maid in a green gown with a dead man's name and a household that despised her. Far better to be the friend of the next duke. A house of her own. An income settled now in writing, against a single sworn account of what any honest woman must have seen in a house like this. No one need ever know it came from her. She had only to tell the truth to Mr. Tunder, Sefton, quietly, and let the law do the rest, and she would never scrub a grate or fear a winter again. Hesper let him finish. Then she said in the plain tone of her father's shop, "You have mistaken the room, sir. I am not for sale. Not to you, not for a house, not for any figure your Mr. Sefton cares to write. I saw nothing in this house, but a good man wronged by a greedy one, and I will swear that, sir, in any court in England, with my hand on any Bible you like." She saw the recognition cross his face, the cold calculation behind the warmth, the closing of one door and the opening of another. She had told him, in refusing, exactly what he had come to learn. The marriage was real. The legal road through the wife was shut. And so, just as she had foretold to Tristan by the fire, Lionel Quayle turned to the other road, and his face when he turned was the face of a man who has decided to make true what he could not prove. "You will regret this," he said softly. "I had hoped to be your friend," and he bowed, and was gone. And within the hour his carriage went down the strewed road in the thaw, and Mr. Sefton did not go with it. Mr. Sefton stayed. What followed was the dark of it, the weeks Hesper would not afterwards speak of without her hand going to her throat. Sefton remained at the Strood Inn, and his work went on in the open. Now a deliberate gathering meant to be seen, meant to frighten. He took sworn statements from the turned-off housekeeper and 2 dismissed grooms. He let it be known in the village that a commission of lunacy would be applied for, that the Duke of Renmore was to be examined, that the new Duchess herself might be called. A physician arrived from London, a doctor, whose name, the bills would later show, was Lionel's creature, and lodged at the inn, and let it be understood he had attended his grace before and could speak to the state of his mind. And then, in the 3rd week, the thing Hesper had foreseen arrived, and it was worse than she had foreseen because it was clever. A letter surfaced. It was produced by Sefton before the local magistrate as evidence in support of the petition. A letter in the Duke's own hand, undated, rambling, full of the dark and broken matter of a mind unmoored. A letter that spoke of voices and of falling into pits and of a great water coming to take him, signed with the Duke's own signature. It was to any eye that did not know the truth, the confession of a madman. And it was a forgery, and Hesper knew it was a forgery the moment Osgar brought a magistrate's copy of it up the stairs, because she had spent 4 months in the Duke's library, reading his furious, cramped arguing hand in the margins of 100 books, and she knew that hand the way she knew her own father's. It was close. It was very close. Sefton's forger had studied the signature well, yet the body of the letter was written by a hand that had never lived inside the Duke's affliction, a hand that imagined madness from the outside, all wild loops and trailing lines, where the Duke's own hand, even at its blackest, was small and tight and savagely controlled. The hand of a man holding himself together by the wrist. And there was one thing more, one thing the forger could not have known to counterfeit, because it lived only on the medical books no stranger had read. The forged letter spoke of the falling sickness in the language of madness, of derangement, of a diseased and guilty mind. The Duke, in 2 decades of his own annotations, had never once written of it so. He had written of it as a thing of the body, a fault no more shameful than a fever, and his repeated marginal why had been the question of a man wronged by his own flesh, never the confession of a man ashamed. The forger had written the letter the world believed the Duke would write. He had not written the letter the Duke would truly have written, because only one person in England had read enough of the real hand to know the difference. That person was the wife he had taken for her silence. The commission was set for the first day of the month at the assize town, a half-day's ride from Strood, before a panel of 3, with the magistrate, the bought physician, the sworn grooms, and the forged letter, all arrayed to prove the Duke of Renmore unfit to govern his own estate and his own person, and to deliver both into the loving administration of his cousin and heir. Tristan would be present. He would be examined. And one hard question from a clever counsel, one cold room and one cruel hour, and the old terror rising, and the very thing they accused him of might be summoned into being before the panel's eyes, the storm called up by the fear of the storm. The night before they rode out, the house was silent with dread, and Hesper went up to his study without knocking, because they were long past knocking. He stood at the dark window. "If they make me speak too long in that room," he said, not turning, "if they press me, and the fear comes, I will fall in front of them, and then it will not be a forgery. It will be true, and they will have their proof for my own body, and there is no defense you can make against a thing they can see with their own eyes." His voice was very quiet. "I have spent 20 years afraid of exactly that room, and tomorrow I must walk into it." She crossed the study to him. The careful yard, the threshold she had felt between them for weeks. She crossed it, and she took his hand, the first time she had touched him since the night on the floor, and his fingers closed over hers as though she were the one fixed thing in a falling world. "You will not be alone in the room," said Hesper. "I will be in it. And if the storm comes, I will do in front of those 3 men exactly what I did on the first night. I will kneel and hold your shoulder, and let them see that the Duchess of Renmore is not ashamed of her husband, and does not fear his affliction, and a man whose own wife kneels beside him without shame is not a madman to be locked away. He is a man with a sickness and a wife who loves him. There is no law against that, Tristan. There is no law in England against being loved." He turned then and looked down at her in the dark, and the stone was wholly gone from his face. "I told you I had nothing warm left to offer. You were wrong," she said. "You had this." And she did not say what this was, and he did not ask, and the threshold was behind them both at last, and for a long moment, in the dark window's cold light, the Duke of Renmore held the apothecary's daughter against his chest, and neither of them said a single word, the way they had said nothing on the first night. Only now, the silence meant the opposite of what it had meant then. The assize room was cold and high and full of men. The panel of 3 sat above on a dais. Lionel Quayle sat below them in a coat that cost a year of any tenant's rent, his face composed in an expression of family grief so well made that Hesper almost admired it. Mr. Sefton sat at his elbow with the papers. The bought physician waited to be called, and the Duke of Renmore came in with his wife, on his arm in her soft green gown, and crossed the cold floor without haste, and seated himself where they bid him, and Hesper sat at his side, and did not let go of his hand, and let every man in the room see that she did not let go of it. The case against him was made well. The household legend, dressed now in physician's Latin. The sworn grooms who spoke of a master never seen, of nights of strange sounds from the locked apartments, of fear among the servants. The bought physician who spoke gravely of the disorder of the brain, the derangement, the unfitness of such a man to control great property and great sums. And then, with the air of a man laying down the final stone, Sefton produced the letter. The Duke's own confession, in the Duke's own hand, the madman's letter of pits and voices, and the great water, and read it aloud in the cold room, while Lionel Quayle bowed his handsome head, as though it grieved him to the soul. When he had done, the eldest of the panel turned to the Duke and asked him gravely, whether he had anything to say in answer. The Duke rose. And the fear was on him. Hesper saw it, the cold high room, and the arrayed enemies, and the old terror climbing his spine. And she saw his breath begin to come short, and she rose with him, and put her hand flat against his back where no one could see it, and held him to the earth.
"I have this to say,"
said the Duke of Renmore, and his voice was level. "I do not deny the affliction. I have carried the falling sickness since I was a boy. It is a fault of the body, gentlemen, no different in kind from a weak heart or a lame leg, and it has never once touched my reason. I have managed my estate, my tenants, and my accounts through the whole of it, as my steward and my books will show. What I deny is that letter. I did not write it. The hand is counterfeit, and I can prove it counterfeit, and I call my wife to do so." A stir went through the room. A wife could not be made to testify against her husband. No law on earth could keep a wife from testifying for him, and that Lionel Quayle had never once considered, because in all his counting he had reckoned Hesper a silence to be bought, or a witness to be feared, and never once a woman who would stand up in a cold assize room and fight. Hesper Lyle rose in her mother's green gown and was sworn, and the room that had decided she was a chambermaid married for her silence learned, in the next quarter hour, what she was. She asked for the forged letter, and the Duke's own library books, 3 of which Oscar had carried the half-day's ride in a leather satchel. She laid them open before the panel. She showed them the Duke's true hand in 100 margins, small and tight and savagely controlled, and the forged hand in the letter, wild and loose and loud, and she named the difference plainly, as her father had taught her to name the difference between 2 powders that might kill or cure. A controlled hand does not become a wild one in the same year, she said, only because the matter is dark. The blackest entry in his true books was written tighter than the lightest line in that letter. This was not a man's hand gone mad. This was a stranger's hand pretending at madness. And then she gave them the thing the forger could not have known. She read aloud from the Duke's own margins, from the medical books no stranger had ever opened, and showed the panel that in 2 decades of his own true hand, the Duke had never once named his sickness a madness or a derangement or a fault of his reason. He had named it a storm in the blood, a fault of the flesh. He had written, "Why?" 100 times the why of a wronged body, never the confession of a guilty mind. The forged letter spoke of derangement and a diseased mind in every line, because the man who wrote it believed, as the whole world believed, that a man so afflicted must be ashamed. The Duke had never been ashamed of his mind. The letter was written by a man who had read the world's lie about the Duke of Renmore. It was not written by the Duke, who had spent his life refusing that lie where only one reader had ever found it. She set down the book. The room was silent. "I have one thing more to say, and then I am done," said Hesper. And she turned not to the panel but to the room. "You have heard that I am a chambermaid, that the Duke married to keep me quiet. It is true. I came to this house to bury my grief and be left alone. And on a winter night I saw my husband at his worst, and he married me because the law would make my silence safe. That was the whole of our bargain, and I will not stand here and pretend it began as love, because this room has had enough of pretty letters that were never true. A sound went through the panel. Yet I have knelt beside that affliction twice before, in my life, over a brother, and beside a husband. And I will tell you what no physician in this room has told you, because none of them has ever held a shoulder through it. It does not touch the mind. It never touched my brother's mind, and it has never touched my husband's. And the only derangement in this matter is a cousin's, who wanted a dukedom badly enough to forge a sick man's hand to steal it. She looked at Lionel Quayle then full and steady. "I am not for sale, sir. I told you that in the gallery. I am telling these gentlemen the same." It was Mr. Sefton who broke, not Lionel, who sat frozen with his handsome grief curdling on his face, but Sefton, the gatherer, the man of business, who had been a forger's accomplice for a fee and not for a dukedom. and who saw the whole edifice come down in the apothecary's daughter's plain quarter hour, and did the practical thing a practical man does when the ship is going under. He stood grey and quiet and told the panel that the letter had been prepared at Mr. Prunney, Quayle's instruction by a writing master in London, and that he, Sefton, would say so under oath in exchange for the court's leniency, and that the physician at the Strood Inn had never in his life attended the Duke. And Lionel Quayle came up out of his chair, with the warmth gone at last, and the hunger bare on his face, and in the cold high room, with 3 magistrates looking down, the next Duke of Ranmore was exposed, not by accident and not by luck, but by a woman who had read his cousin's true hand and would not be bought, and there was no dignity in it for him, and none was given. The panel found the petition not only refused, but fraudulent. The forged letter was impounded. The matter of Mr. Comfort, Quayle and his writing master, was passed to other authorities, who in the fullness of time would make of it what the law made of such things. And the cousin who had come north in a carriage too good for his debts to take a dukedom went south again with nothing. His confident certainty broken not on a stroke of fortune, but on the one thing his whole counting life had never taught him to value, the worth of a quiet woman he had dismissed at the foot of a stair. They did not speak on the ride home. The thaw had given way to a clean cold, and the country lay washed under it, and Hesper watched the bare trees go by, and felt the Duke's shoulder against hers in the carriage, and did not move away from it, and he did not move away from hers, and somewhere on the Strood road, without a word. It was in the gallery that evening, before the portrait she had turned back to the wall, that he said the thing at last. The laughing officer looked down at them both. The fire was lit, and the Duke of Ranmore, who had taken a chambermaid to wife to silence her, and had been saved, instead, from his own ruin by her voice, turned to her, and used her name as he had never used it. Slowly, as a man lays down a thing he has carried a long way and means never to pick up again. "Hesper," he said, "I married you to keep you silent. And in a cold room, you were the only voice that saved me. I have nothing warm left to offer, I told you. It was the truest lie I ever told. I have everything. I have had it since the night you knelt on my floor and would not let me fall alone. I am asking you now, not for your silence. I am asking you to stay, not behind the wall, on this side of it, with me." And the apothecary's daughter, who had come to a house no one wanted to be left alone in it, looked up at the man she had known before she knew the Duke, and crossed the last of the careful yard between them, and answered him not with the silence of the first night, but with the opposite of it. "I turned my key a long while ago, Tristan," she said. "I have only been waiting for you to turn yours." He turned it, and the lock that had been built for 2 strangers to be left alone behind opened, at last, on 2 people who had chosen, in the end, not to be alone at all. The bell above his apartment still rang. On the hard nights, in the deep of the worst winters, it no longer rang into an empty house and a forbidden door. It rang, and she was already on the stairs as she had been the first night, and she knelt and turned his head and held his shoulder through the slow 100 counts. And when his breath came back and his eyes opened, they opened on her face above him in the firelight, and he was not ashamed, and he was not alone, and neither, any longer, was she. In the spring she turned the laughing officer's portrait once more to the light, and set beside it her father's brass apothecary scales, polished and placed on the gallery shelf where the morning sun would find them, the 2 pans level and empty, the way a thing is level when nothing is being weighed against anything anymore. When the bargain is done, and what is left is only what was true beneath it the whole time. She passed them every morning on her way down. She never had to weigh a single thing again. If Hesper's long winter moved you, stay a moment in it before you go, and remember that the quietest person in any cold house may be the one holding it up. Thank you for staying to the end.